Hello, everybody. This video is going to go over some of the highlights of the PowerPoint slides called Programming Languages. So it's a history of programming languages. So what I'm going to do, you can look at the slides yourself, but I'm going to go through the important part and kind of go a little faster through the things that are less important. So if you're looking at, I'm going to, oops, I'm going to take a look at the PowerPoint slides that we would go over in class. So this is called Programming Languages. And so it's a brief history. And I'm going to go through it quickly, the early part, and then I'm going to show you the part that's important. So in the beginning, there was just a machine. There were no programming languages. People plugged in cables into, wire into holes, and each hole represented a one. And if it was had a wire in it, if there's no wire in it, it had a zero. Very early on, this is a picture of a very early machine. 1940s. You can see how big it is. This is like the side. That's a memory module over there with probably a few hundred bits, maybe 1,000 bits. I don't know. Transistors, very hot, very big, very clumsy. So early on, there was something called assembly language, which you would study in computer architecture class. Uses mnemonics instead of zeros and ones. So as I said, I'm going to go through this part quickly. So this is important. So some of the early programming languages. So people don't have to program with zeros and ones, very tedious, or semi-language. High-level programming languages developed in the late 1950s. So if you look at the history of the computer itself, 1945 roughly. So the early programming languages, the high-level programming languages came around in the late 50s. So it's about 15 years after the invention of the first digital computer. And the program that translates a high-level language into a machine language, which is the only language that computers understand, is known as a compiler. Some of the very earliest ones were, this is actually, so I studied computer science, not computer science, but programming in the 1968 when I was in high school. And this is actually the computer I use right here. It's called an IBM 1130 computer. It says 1130 over there in the corner. And this is where the punch cards went in. This is a printer, so you can spit things out, but this is the console. And you could actually interact with this machine using some data switches, which was sitting right here on the top of the console. That was my high school computer. Anyway, the earliest ones, the ones that I first learned about, was called Fortran. So Fortran was absolutely the first major programming language used by the science and engineering world. And it was first invented in 1957. Came into its prominence in the 60s, and it is actually still in use today. So people still program in Fortran, especially if they're in the science and engineering world, because it's very good, still is, at crunching numbers, big systems of equations, lots of variables. Fortran is still a good. So please remember this one. This is Fortran, first high-level programming language useful to the science and engineering community. Another example of programming language developed about the same time, maybe a little bit later, 1960 or so, was called COBOL. So COBOL was written not for the science and engineering folks, but for the business community, because it was sort of optimized for building business reports, data collecting, analyzing the kinds of things that people in business needed. So that's why it's called Common Business Oriented Language, otherwise known as COBOL. Big programming language used by a ton of people, not so much in use today because certain languages took its place. So COBOL was an important programming language. Okay, Lisp, also not as important, but it was used in the early days of artificial intelligence, which actually goes back to the 50s. BASIC was used by because they thought everybody in the world was going to be programming, students of all kinds, elementary school, middle school, all kinds of folks were writing BASIC. There is a language still around today called Visual Basic, which was used for some early video games, Visual Basic. Some of you may know it. But there was a need for structured programming languages, and that neither Fortran at the time nor COBOL was a structured programming language. That means it was a little hard to debug. The code was pretty tangled up. So the very first structured programming language was called Pascal, which is what I used when I was in graduate school in the middle 80s. It sort of developed in the middle 70s and came into its own in the 80s. And it was used in universities to teach structured programming. And it was a very important language because structured programming languages were easier to debug. However, big programming language, very important, was called C. C was developed by some folks at Bell Labs, and it was structured like Pascal, unlike Fortran. So it was a structured programming language, but it also compiled very fast. So it was a very efficient programming language in both its development and also in how it translated into machine language. So it was big migration into C because it was the best of all worlds. All right. And along comes Windows, which occurs in the late 80s, and there's a need for programming languages to write for a Windows environment, and that big language was known as C++. So C++ basically took C and enhanced it, made it a language useful for Windows applications. In other words, it was a object-oriented programming language, which C was not. C was a procedural programming language. All right, the next big deal is the internet. So the internet comes along, and now there's a need for programming languages on the internet. And the big language for that is called Java. Okay, so remember that. Java was the programming language developed for internet applications. That means client server applications. Anytime you're doing commerce, doing business on the internet, anything that's happening on the internet through what you do, a lot of the code behind the scene is Java. So that was an important programming language in the early days, not early days of the internet, because it's other programming language like Python and so forth, but Java was really the early one. In fact, so life continues. We have the mobile platforms, which again, I'm going through this part, it's not on the test, but you do have handheld devices, mobile platforms, programming languages are useful there. Apple developed something called Objective-C for all of its applications that run on its handheld devices, and Android devices still use Java, so still important. All right, so that was a quick and dirty. Tomorrow, who knows? It doesn't matter what the latest programming language is. The idea is to just learn to solve problems using any programming language, and whatever it is, all programming languages have to use the basic same structures, if-else statements, looping structures, and so on. There is no other way. So that is a quick and dirty of the topic known as a history of programming languages.